creator, all of these are cognates that we share on a one-for-one Hebrew to Arabic basis. And if you're curious about that, I always put further literature here because I know I have to go a little bit quickly to say everything I want to say. So this is a way, one of the names of Allah is al-haq, the truth, the reality. So this is, even if we're, as Muslims, in a dialogue with people who come from a non-theistic philosophical background, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the truth, right? That's just a common concept across human cultures, this idea of truth or idea of reality. So that for us is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. When we come into, say, for instance, Buddhist traditions, some Buddhist traditions identify consciousness as the pervasive, unifying essence. And we have a name of Allah, al-Khabir, which is the awareness. So there's ways in which, even when we're nestled in a theistic tradition, that the Asma Allah, the names for God, can even help us relate to people who don't have a theistic tradition. Now, in Islam, I've spent a lot of time at Brandeis University, a Jewish university, in a faculty that studies Judaism. I've taught spent 3 years on the faculty of a rabbinical school. And so I've had this really rich exchange with Jewish thinkers on the nature of the divine and etc. And one thing that I've noticed is that in especially liberal Jewish spaces, there's more of a willingness to see a God in process in some way, a God who learns from human beings. And this is in contrast, I think, to what we would see, even though, as I mentioned, we have similar names and similar ideas, at least when it comes to more progressive, liberal strands of Judaism, our ways of understanding the divine are quite different in that regard. And we also, in Islam, we don't say Father for the divine as well. So that's another kind of prominent difference from a comparative perspective. As I said, I would stress both some of the similarities and some of the differences. And so for Muslims, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the essence who has no need for human beings. El-Ghani, totally the one who is free of all need. And this is a core principle of the understanding of the divine. And so when it comes to a Muslim Christian understanding, we understand that the divine being doesn't need our sacrifices. We still make sacrifices because we need to reform ourselves. We need to transform our ego by letting it know that it is not actually the one in charge of affairs, even though the ego, as we all probably know, likes to be in charge of affairs, that the ego isn't the greatest. And so that's the purpose for Muslims when we think about sacrifice. So we don't need in a Christian theological understanding, we don't need a redeeming sacrifice. Our relationship is a direct one, unmediated, and that's so very important to the Islamic understanding of the divine being. So Allah is al-Ghani and also al-Mughni, the enricher. And so we understand that any material wealth that we might have, it's sort of on loan from the divine. And what do we do with it? How do we use it? And that's the essence of what shows us who we are, what is our character. So God, the Muslim God, is a loving God, and this is kind of one of the points where we come to some of the polemical images of Muslims, that somehow the God is only a wrathful God, and that's why Muslims are vengeful people, or a'udhu billah, far from it to think that. We say that God is loving, the wudud, and I think I met a person here at the mosque who's muwaddid, I think I met or muhabb, I think I met a muhabb. But anyway, this word for love means the type of love of proximity, the type of love that is, for instance, wadud you see here, favorably disposed, devoted, friendly, fond. This is to experience Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the God Most High, is al-wadud, the loving, is so core. It's one of the Asma Allah. It's one of the very prominent names. So we share with Christianity this emphasis on a very loving God. But as I mentioned before, there's these certain differences between how we understand love. Now, in Islamic understandings, we have God is graceful, God is gracious, God is merciful, compassionate, etc. All of these, what we call the beautiful names of God. And so we as human beings, we call on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we ask that we have just a tiny sliver of the mercy in our being that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put into the universe from this divine, beautiful nature. We ask for qualities like graciousness, etc. So we understand that those qualities, as we experience them as human beings, they flow through human beings through the divine actions, the divine being, etc. So this is the way in which we relate to the divine, by performing acts of ibadah that show our love. Ibadah is worship, servanthood. So performing acts that demonstrate our love, our care, our gratitude, our shukr, our feelings of indebtedness to this divine that supplies us with everything. So this is one of my favorite books on love in the Holy Qur'an. I'm warning you, if you buy it, it is about this thick though. So love in the Holy Qur'an, there's a lot to say on it. This is by Prince Ghazi bin Muhammad. Very fascinating figure, has been educated at Al-Azhar, which is one of the most esteemed institutions of Islamic learning in the Sunni and Muslim world. And it also has a degree in Islamic sciences from Sorbonne, so it has both the East-West education, and may he go on to keep writing and producing wonderful books. So the Quran, remember I said that wadud is fondness, it's proximity, it constitutes a favorable opinion of. So while Allah is merciful, that mercy extends to all of creation, Allah's name al-wadud, it's accessible to anybody, but the Quran also says that God does not love certain people. And you have to understand that love doesn't mean that they don't get compassion, that they don't experience the grace of Allah, that they aren't breathing, getting sustenance, etc. But that certain actions take us either closer or further from this divine proximity. So, for instance, giving charity, right? Fasting, praying. These are all acts that allow us to transform our hearts so that we can experience the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we can demonstrate our own love. So we come to this philosophical question that I told you, Allah is qareeb, close. Where is Allah? Allah is qareeb. Allah is close. So in esoteric traditions in Islam, and I just pulled this as an example of coming out of an esoteric work, we don't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in the created material universe. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not, we are creatures, we are made of material substances. We understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is nothing like what we understand, experience in the created world. But that being said, we still do experience proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how is that possible? How is it possible that when we pray, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the mujib, the one who answers? There's verses in the Quran. There's verses in the Quran that talk about Allah is closer than the jugular vein, which is, connects the heart to the mind, is what allows consciousness to be possible. There's verses that talk about whenever a servant calls upon, God says in the first person, whenever a servant calls upon me, I am near. So there's this radical immanence as well as a profound transcendence. So this could very well be us in a few minutes here, but this is actually a photo from a langar, a meal in a Sikh gurdwara. And here's the top is a symbol I'd like you all to know. This is in the Gurmukhi script, and it means there's one God, essentially, in the Gurmukhi script. And so Sikhism is very close theologically to an Islamic understanding of divine oneness. And here I have what's called in Sikhism the Mul mantra, Mul meaning seed. So this is kind of, if I could make an equivalent, almost like the Fatiha for Muslims, or even Surah Al-Ikhlas for Muslims, Qul huwallahu ahad. This is maybe the Sikh equivalent of what that would be. And so I just invite you, especially if you haven't really encountered Sikhism before, to take a look at this Mul mantra that summarizes the theology. And Sikhs do hymns, and so the Mul mantra, if you look it up and hear it performed, it's a very beautiful, very beautiful melodic mantra. Now we come to Indian traditions, the ancient Vedic traditions. We have an idea of Advaita, meaning non-duality. So this, whereas I won't be able to get into it, but I will say that this book here, is a fairly recent book, shows this robust exchange, philosophical, theological exchange between Muslims and Hindus, who both emphasize divine oneness, although in slightly different metaphysical terms. So if you're into philosophy, and only if you're into philosophy because it's dense, this is an excellent that work that, especially if you have roots in the subcontinent, this is a really excellent book on the comparison and the differences. So again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in the world in the same way that maybe a Hindu practitioner might see the divine in all of these things, but yet we can, as Muslims, look to certain properties that are in objects and say, this is a reflection of the quality of Allah that is an al-kabir or the like. So that we can look to the horizon, for instance, and understand something of what the Asma'ullah al-Wasi'a means. God is the expander. Well, we can look at the horizon and that even baffles our mind. So, the heavens, they're expanding, right? We don't even know the extent of them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater than anything of that. So we still do, as Muslims, look to the universe to help us understand our theology. And even some traditions within Islam, some philosophical traditions will say, the world is the revealed kitab, like you can read the world of signs, of ayat, just like you read the Qur'an and it has verses, and those are called ayat. So we can read the ayat in the Qur'an and we look up and we see that manifestation that affirms what we've read in the Qur'an. So science is a way of, can be a spiritual practice. So here's two verses that I mentioned before that talk about this proximity. I think I might have to go a little bit faster to keep on the pace. But what I'll say about this is that as Muslims, we interpret divine benevolence to outweigh God's wrath. So there's a hadith that the Prophet narrates in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us that Allah's mercy overweighs Allah's wrath. So Allah has placed the constraint that Allah's mercy overweighs Allah's wrath on God's self. So let me just skip a little faster. So when we think about other traditions that have a sense of undergirding also a kind of a cosmic divine, and then human beings perform specific types of rituals and acts to draw nearer to that divine, we can see that pattern over and over, whether it's traditions coming out of West Africa. So I put this book up out of a fantastic scholar who looks at the West African Islamic tradition and the West African tradition that comes out of Yoruba, and looks at some of the comparisons between how understanding of oneself and the world work together to create an understanding of what the nature of the divine, to the extent that that's possible for human beings. So now let me just delve a tiny bit into morality and show you some of the exciting principles. So when we think about morality, it's not, in my understanding, something that you just have or don't have, but it's something that you're striving towards. So in Islam, we're always striving to refine our character, to take wherever we are and take it to the next level and the next level. And so the Prophet ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him, represents the highest ideal. The Prophet Isa, for instance, a highest ideal of how to embody virtue in the world. And so this is the purpose of human life, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to worship God, and to improve our character, and to exhibit, to be a person of benefit who benefits others. So even when we look to ancient Chinese philosophy, we see some of these very similar concepts. And here I've kind of translated some that, they're not one for one exactly the same, but we can really have a robust dialogue over, what does ihsan, for instance, coming from the word that means beauty, it means moral excellence. Is that like ren, for instance, or al-ma'ruf, the kind of the upright way of being? Is that like the Chinese idea? And my daughter speaks Chinese and makes fun of me every time I try, so I will not try. So in other words, I put a saying of Confucius, one of the many that really deeply resonates with me as a Muslim, about dignity and the treatment of children and subordinates, and how we create a just society through justice in the home, and justice kind of in these layers. The Confucian and Islamic ideals in many cases are so close that we have something called the Han Kitab, which is the Quran translated into Confucian terms here. So if you're curious about it, I'll point you to this article in the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences. But those of you who know the Quran well can start to see what these topics might be referring to in Arabic. But so that to say, there's so much to mine in terms of morality, but also even metaphysics. I put this book up here. Daniel Wildcat is, of course, right down the road at Haskell University and has been one of the premier climate activists. Islam is so deeply grounded in the beauty of the natural world and in the role of the human being as khalifa, as a steward of this natural world. I think we forget that a lot as Muslims, and I'm guilty as much as anyone. But what can we learn from studying native cosmologies that very much take seriously this stewardship? And what can we learn as Muslims that we already have in our own tradition, but that we can kind of recommit ourselves to by looking at the inspiration of people who have centered their spiritual lives around caretaking? This is one of the Qur'anic verses that sort of gives me chills when I read it, one of the many. Corruption has appeared throughout the land and sea because of what the hands of people have brought forth, right? So God is letting them taste just a part of the consequences of what they have done, that perhaps they will return to righteousness. I see this every time I think of this verse, every time I just look at the land degradation or the degradation of the sea. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse says just a part, right? And so it's deeply, this verse in particular, I think if we're in spaces where we're thinking about environmental justice, this is a fantastic verse of the Quran to really startle us and out of our apathies. Of course, the Quran has so many verses on interdependence, and this is a core, whether we're in Indian philosophies or in other places, interdependence is so key to so many of the world's religious traditions. So again, reading the signs and understanding all of these benefits that God has put in the world for humankind to use and not to abuse. So if we think about Taoist philosophy, for instance, that's about the complementary dualities. The Quran, so much of the poetics of the Quran rests on the sun and the moon and the heavens and the earth. And so there's a beautiful book by Sakicho Murata, who is a Japanese scholar and who works in the Taoist tradition and who also works on the Islamic tradition, and it's called the Tao of Islam. Very beautiful in terms of these types of verses that evoke a spirituality from us, from thinking about the perfected opposites that are in creation. This is the Tao Te Ching, one of the classics coming out of Confucianism. And if you just read this the first passage of the volume, you can see in so many ways that even this idea of Tao could make for interesting philosophical conversations when compared to the Asma Allah. So I'm just kind of putting out ideas there. I'm going to skip a little bit faster, but seeing we have a tendency maybe as human beings to become arrogant and see ourselves above all of the other species, but it's a spiritual practice to stop and to reflect and to see this interdependence and this continuity. And this particular picture I pulled off a Jain website, Jains being one of the philosophies that comes out of the Indian subcontinent that is very emphatically focused on protection of the earth. This idea of ahimsa, non-violence, being extended, coming from Buddhist, Hindu, Jain traditions, being extended as well to the natural world. When do we do violence to the natural world? I think it's a very, very provocative question. In Jainism, there's an idea of the soul actually having like a weight to it, and you free your soul by having less bad karma essentially attached to it. And this metaphor got me thinking a lot of so many of the Islamic metaphors of the scales, right? So it's this similar, it's giving human beings this very tangible sense of you do wrong, your scales or bad deeds are going to become heavy. Your soul is going to become heavy, going to become the opposite of enlightened. And we have in Islam, this is a Qur'anic passage, no bearer of burdens shall bear the burden of another. So it's a radical moral accountability, and we see that radical accountability, I think, very, very strongly in karmic traditions. Turning a little bit to Buddhism, again, I hinted at this at the beginning, where awareness is so very prominent, and we could think of awareness through multiple terms in Islam, maybe khushu', meaning like awareness in our prayer life or the like. But there's much I think we can learn in terms of talking with Buddhist practitioners around what is mindfulness, right? Because so much of what we could call taqwa, maybe we translate it as God consciousness, but we could also potentially translate